Well, how many of you have experienced joyful obedience in your life? I'd like to see if that idea registers in any way with us. Joyful obedience. Part of what we're doing today is I want to rescue the idea of obedience from being a heavy and a negative thing to being a joyful thing, because obedience from the beginning of God's creation was meant to be a joyful thing. In fact, we know from many, many, many psychological studies that when we have boundaries, we can live more joyfully. When there are not boundaries in life, we live anxiously and afraid because we just don't know where we are or what we're doing. But when there is boundaries and there's relationship that has impacts upon our lives and asks something of us, we can live more joyfully. And so I want to ask again, how many of you have experienced joyful obedience in your life and the impact of that? The impact of that. Okay. I want to lift up that idea. I want to rescue the idea of obedience today because it is meant to be something that is life-giving instead of life and joy-taking. You probably noticed as we went through our reading today that Emily read that the name Bethel just keeps coming up and up again and again in these early stories of the worshiping people of God. Did you notice that? Bethel, again, over and over again. God was doing something with this place called Bethel. And it means the house of God. Beth-el, Beit-el, house of God. And it's interesting that as Abram was brought into the land of Canaan, the place that God was calling him and his descendants to be, that it was at Bethel that he first worshiped. Remember, he built an altar there, he called upon the name of the Lord. And then he returned. Last week we saw this. When he came back from Egypt, after sojourning there, he came back to Bethel. God was establishing Bethel as a beachhead, as a beginning point of bringing light into the land of Canaan. And he was teaching this family. You have to remember that we're talking about the people of God as being one family at that point. It was Abraham, and it was Isaac, and it was Jacob. We have 3 generations of people who are now walking with the Lord in this new land as a light in a very dark place. And I want to spend some time today understanding why Canaan was described or can be described as spiritually dark, and why God wanted to establish a beachhead of his influence, a place where his nature and his character would be communicated and known in such a dark land. I think it's so interesting to me that it was Canaan that God chose as the promised land because it was a place of such incredible spiritual darkness. And we're going to lay the case for that today. I want to open that up because sometimes in our own modern sensibilities today, we think, well, we don't want to talk that way about other people's beliefs. But I want to explain what God intended to rescue that land from. And so we're going to look at the spiritual darkness that was at work in the land of Canaan and how God had chosen it graciously as a place where he would bring his promises and his character and hope and light. And it was starting at Bethel, at the house of God. Worship in the land of Canaan. I want us to get this right. Worship in the land of Canaan was dominated by darkness, the darkness of fertility cults. The gods the people worshipped in Canaan primarily were Baal and Asherah. I think you have probably heard those names before. And the worship of these gods, I want us to get this right and understand this, involved temple prostitution. Okay? So as we are opening up the idea of what the darkness that dominated Canaan was, worship of Baal and Asherah meant temple prostitution. You were enacting in your own life what you were hoping for in your fields. Okay? That's the idea of the fertility cults associated with these gods. Worship was dark, was a dark experience. And if you're a student of the Old Testament, you know that Baal and Asherah were the gods that the people of God later on were tempted to worship. They were pulled into the fertility cults of Canaan, understanding, believing that if they worshiped in this way, God would bless their flocks, and these gods would bless not God of Abraham, but these gods would bless their flocks and bless their fields. And God constantly said, do not prostitute yourselves with these foreign gods, right? God wanted to call the people back out of that darkness and into relationship with him. We have to understand that this was a highly sexualized cult. And I want to show you some of the images of the idols that the Canaanites worshipped. I decided not to show an image of Asherah because she's just not very appropriate, okay? But I do want to show you a picture of her consort, who is Baal, who is the storm god. And so the idea here was that if you worship these gods, you would be able to influence the weather through the storm god to bring rain on your fields. And if you worshiped at the cult of Asherah, then your family would be fruitful and everything would go well for you. This is the darkness that we are talking about. Now, it's probably been lost here, but this picture of Baal, normally he had a thunderbolt in his hand, okay? He was the god of war and the god of the weather. And we know from last week that since Canaan was subject to frequent famines, there's a reason that people were appealing to these fertility cults and storm gods prior to the influence of the people of God, prior to the calling of Abraham into this place. But we need to go further, because as dark as this sounds, there was something much darker. These are demonic influence gods, by the way, and the Bible refers to a very, very evil one, Moloch, the detestable god of the Amorites. And again, our modern sensibilities kind of shiver as we think, should we talk about other people's religions in such a way? But we have to understand what we're talking about here. Worship of Moloch required, do you know? Child sacrifice. In such an extreme and brutal way, where a live baby was placed on a hot plate and served into the fire, which was Moloch's mouth. This is what worship of this demon god required for fertility, that your life would go well. This is the land into which God called Abraham, so that Abraham would be a light of covenant and the true nature of the God of love, to bring light to a land of incredible darkness, okay? This is the grace of God enacted in a land that he wanted to call for his own. Now, we also have to remember that sometimes the Israelites were tempted again into those religions, and God then used the Canaanite tribes to punish the Israelites, okay? So we have to understand that what God was trying to do here was to bring a reflection of his good character through the people who would follow him. And that's why when the Hebrews were released from captivity in Egypt and God presented them with the 10 Commandments, they rejoiced, because the requirements of this God of love were so good in comparison with the gods that they had known previously, also in Egypt. Imagine the idea of tithing in comparison to child sacrifice in these fertility cults. Here was a God who truly knew his people and truly loved them. And as we consider the establishment of Bethel as God's beachhead in the land, we see why it was called the house of God, the place where God was saying, come and meet me, come and know me. And here's how we are continuing today with the story of Jacob. Genesis 35, if you have an opportunity to turn there, I would encourage you to do that. We see that just as with his grandfather, Abram, who had come first to Bethel, who had built an altar there and demonstrated his gratefulness, and then returned to Bethel again after his time of sojourning in Egypt, and he came back then in submission. These are the themes that we are looking at for worship: gratitude and then submission. We see that Jacob is now called to Bethel, a place where God wanted to speak with him. And we know that Jacob had been there before. This is Jacob's return trip to the house of God. He had been there previously, having built an altar where God had spoken to him when he was returning to meet his brother Esau for the first time after many decades. How many of you know the family drama at work between Jacob and Esau? Jacob, who had stolen the birthright with the help of his mother, and Esau, who was the firstborn, was left with nothing but a pot of turnips, if I remember correctly, or whatever. Or was it mandrakes? Whatever it was. Lentils. It was lentil soup. That's right, that he traded his birthright for. And Jacob was so afraid of facing his brother again. He thought he would be killed. And it was at Bethel that God spoke to him and reassured him, "Trust me, Jacob, trust me." And when Jacob met Esau, do you remember what happened? Esau threw his arms open and welcomed his brother, for Esau had had his own walk with God. Esau had also been able to let go of the past. And for all of us who in some way are working through family difficulties in any way, know the grace of God upon families and how he can bring reconciliation and joy in so many circumstances. Families are meant to be joyful places where we know and love one another. So Jacob had been rescued from his trickery, rescued from his deceitful ways, and called at the house of God to know this God who was calling him now into obedience. Worship is obedience. That's our word that we are looking at today. This third week in this series, we went from gratitude to submission and now to obedience. I want to suggest today that submission is the flip side of the coin of obedience, in the sense that submission is momentary and obedience is the long walk. And I want to invite each of us today to consider if you are feeling called in your life to a deeper experience of obedience to the Lord. Are there aspects of our lives that we, like Jacob and his family, we have to leave behind because we know that that particular area is not completely surrendered to God's ways? And now, as God is revealing that place, that deeper layer in our lives, he's saying, I want this too. I want you to leave that behind and to come into a deeper place of joyful obedience with me. It's exactly what God was doing to Jacob. We're going to look at the first 4 chapters of our reading today, chapter 35, what theologians refer to as a purification ritual that Jacob and his family were going through. When we find out that members of Jacob's family had also gone adrift into the surrounding Canaanite culture. They had idols that they were carrying, and they had to give them up. If they were going to come to worship God at Bethel, they had to first leave those idols behind, for they had come to worship probably Baal and Asherah, and maybe others as well. And maybe we can relate because we are also surrounded by a culture filled with fertility cults. Maybe not in the way that we are thinking about today, but fertility cults of wealth and power that are so much at the heart of our culture. That is also a fertility cult, looking to see that things will go well, wanting wealth, wanting power. We are drawn by that as well. We're not so different from the land of Canaan when we get down to basics. But Jacob, having heard from the God of his grandfather, Jacob is called to obedience in worship and practice. He says to his family, get rid of those foreign gods. Come and change your clothes. Purify yourself. Come with me to Bethel. We're going back to where we know this first started, to hear the God who has spoken to us before. Jacob's knowledge of God is profoundly personal, and it is demonstrated through his obedience. Let's bury those idols. Let's bury even our earrings. Another Canaanite thing was piercing of the ears, and they tore off these symbols of idolatry and put them into the ground under a tree, another marker in the land. Just like those altars that they have built, a marker, a benchmark. Every time they would pass that tree, they would know here is where we gave up our disobedience to be obedient to God of love, the landscape of their spiritual lives. So, given our investigation into the altars of these patriarchs, we see that Jacob changed the name of Bethel. Did you catch it? To El Bethel. Now, back then, they didn't have exclamation marks. The way that they would put an exclamation mark on something was somehow doubling up the name. So here we have house of God, which under Jacob becomes God's house of God, or God of God's house. This is an exclamation mark. It goes from Bethel to Bethel! Joyful obedience. Joyfully coming back into the plan of God, knowing that they are going to find the blessing of the covenant unfolding for them at Bethel, a benchmark, a place of spiritual commitment and turning of the corner. And as Jacob renames this altar that his grandfather first established, God returns the favor and renames Jacob. You see, the name of Jacob sounds like the Hebrew word for one who deceives. The idiom that they used was grasping of the heel, okay? Or we might say underhanded, okay? This is the way that Jacob, his name sounded like that. Anytime somebody called his name, they were basically saying, hey, deception. Hey, deceiver. Hey, trickster. Come over here for a minute. Every time Jacob heard his name, this moniker, this name that he lived under, that he endured, that is what he was reminded of. And many of us have been called by many different names, by those who love us and also by those who have not loved us. And those names hang over us. Names are that powerful. They mark us. They become a burden if they are negative. What does your name mean? My full name, Mark David Shainhalls, means mighty warrior with a nice neck, a nice throat. What do you think? Breathtaking, isn't it? I had a friend in college whose name meant warrior from the wooden village. He loved that. What a great name, right? What does your name mean if you know the etymology of your first name, your middle name, your last name? Here's the thing. God can erase all of those names with the power of his word, and all it takes is joyful obedience. He can rename us. He can rename us. You see, Jacob, as a deceiver, had almost made a mess of his life. It was trending that way. But each time God called him, Jacob listened and followed, and he learned to be obedient. And in this renewal of the covenant, God now asked for a lifelong obedience. and gave Jacob a new name. And that new name was Israel, which translates as one who strives with, or one who struggles with, or one who wrestles with God. A reminder, not of his deception, but instead of the fact that Jacob at one point had grabbed a hold of the angel of the Lord and wrestled with him through the night. Jacob was ceasing to be a deceiver and becoming one who would lay hold of the promises of God and not let go. And this was going to be the new moniker, the new meaning of his life. Jacob became Israel, became a nation of people who have wrestled with God. We know that Jesus is the perfect Israelite. I want to explore this for a minute. The night before his crucifixion, Jesus wrestled with the Father over the plan of salvation. Let this cup pass from me. But if it is your will, I am here with joyful obedience. This is the final fulfillment of Jesus' role as the perfect Jacob, the perfect Israelite. The scene from the Garden of Gethsemane is the fulfillment of that very thing, where Jesus, who becomes for us the new Adam, he also becomes for us the new Israel, the new Jacob, the new one who wrestles on our behalf and sacrifices on our behalf. God's plan is perfect, and we can spend a lifetime understanding all of these different connections and significances, just as we are called to a lifelong obedience and a lifelong worship. For God calls us to these very same things that he called the patriarchs to. He called them to gratitude, he called them to submission, and he called them to obedience. And we are called through those very same things ourselves, and all the things that we will investigate in the remainder of this series. I'd like to invite each of us right now just to take a few minutes. I'm going to call Jay up if he'd like to provide a little bit of music just quietly. There is some space in your bulletin. I just would like to invite you to take a moment and to consider prayerfully as you come to your own Bethel today. Is there a place, an area of life right now that God is highlighting that requires a new obedience, a new place in our life, something that we are being asked to leave behind in order to continue to be one who is walking with God and who is coming to Bethel, to the house of God? We are called to be people who are leaving things behind, who are discarding, who are recognizing aspects of our lives that we need to drop into the earth so that our worship can be more complete, so that our walk with God can be more obedient. And we all have those places. I do myself. I know what mine is. I invite you to change those clothes today, to take a few minutes to reflect and to pray before we continue to worship.